Today, I'm making an Easter dress for my baby girl, Violet. I'm doing this with my friend Marie, who is also making an Easter outfit for her baby boy, Ruben. Now I'm gonna give Marie a minute to introduce herself, and then we'll get on to making the Easter dress.
Hi, my name is Marie, and this here is Ruben, my 6-week-old. Today on my sewing channel, I'm sharing with you this outfit here. Ruben is my youngest kid out of my 4 kids. I have 4 kids aged 4 years old and younger. I'd love for you to come over to my channel after you finish watching this video here to watch as I make this outfit here for Ruben, or you can have a look around my channel at some other sewing projects that might interest you. I love to sew for my kids, myself, and my home. So I hope to see you there.
Thank you for your introduction, Marie. Now, on to the Easter dress.
So this is more or less the idea that I have for this, is to use the bottom layer of this pink cotton fabric and then a sheer overlay on the bodice of the lace. I guess it's not really sheer, it's a lace overlay. And then a ribbon around the waist and this organza on the skirt. So that's my plan, and we will see how it works out.
The pattern I chose to make this Easter dress from is the baby Alexandria from Little Lizard King. It was such a pretty dress by its pictures, so I decided I wanted to make it, although I had no idea what I was in for when I chose it. Basically, that just means it had a lot more work to it than I first thought. I filmed the process of cutting out this fabric, but I'm blurring out the pattern pieces out of respect for the designer. While cutting out the fabric, I realized that I didn't pay attention to how wide my fabric needed to be when I bought it, so I actually didn't have enough fabric for how wide the pattern said the skirt should be. So I deviated a little bit and I just used the width that I had. Now that means that the skirt won't be as full, but that's okay because I have other plans. The pattern called for 1 skirt overlay, but I actually cut 2. I thought it would add a nice look to the layered effect, and it would also add a little more fullness to the skirt since I'm missing out on some of that anyways. After cutting out the fabric, there was a little bit more prep work that needed to be done before I could actually assemble the pattern pieces. Sewing with lace can actually be pretty tricky, and in order to keep things consistent and looking sharp, it's best to baste the lace to the main fabric. Then you can treat it as one layer and sew it together a little easier. And I've mentioned this in other videos, but in case you haven't watched those and don't know what basting is a temporary stitch that's not meant to hold your fabric. You do this with the longest stitch that your sewing machine has, and you don't backstitch when you do it. Basically, it's just a stitch that's easy to unpick. I basted the lace to the main fabric on all 3 bodice pieces. Now after basting the lace to the main fabric, I can sew and assemble the bodice, starting with the shoulder seams. Now, this dress has a lining. So what I do to the main bodice, I also have to do to the lining. So I'm also attaching the shoulder seams together on the lining. Then to help things lay nice and flat, I need to iron open the shoulder seams. I'm doing this on the main bodice and also on the lining. After the shoulder seams are ironed flat, I can now attach the lining to the main bodice and stitch around the neck. I'm putting the lining and the main bodice right sides together and stitching around the neck and down the sides of the back. Doing this will enclose the seams to the inside of the bodice. Now that the neckline is sewn, I need to cut notches around the curve. If I had pinking shears, this would be a lot easier, but I don't have any, so I have to do this individually and cut out each notch. Now that that's done, I can sew the side seams. There are 4 side seams in total, because I have to do 2 of the main bodice and 2 of the lining. After sewing the side seams, I need to iron them flat. And in the process of ironing them, I did realize that I sewed one of them wrong. So yet again, I get my frenemy, the seam ripper, and tear out the stitches. Once that seam is unpicked, I can put it the right way and sew it together. Now I need to baste the armhole main bodice and lining pieces together. This will help them stay properly aligned when I attach the sleeve. Also, I'm really glad I'm not making the newborn size because fitting an armhole smaller than this in my sewing machine would feel impossible. Now it's time to work on the sleeves. Again, I deviated from the pattern and made it the way I wanted, instead of the way the pattern said to. I didn't want to have to hem the sleeve, so I put the lace and the lining right sides together and sewed along the hemline with a 1/2 inch seam allowance. This enclosed the raw edges and hemmed it automatically. Then I turned it right side out and ironed it flat. After that, I basted the rest of the lace around the lining piece on both sleeve pieces. The sleeves on this dress have a slight gather at the top, so I had to sew a gathering stitch on both sleeves. The next step is to sew the side seams of the sleeves together on both sleeves. I can now attach the sleeve to the bodice on both sides. This was a little tricky because I had to keep playing around with the gathers to get them to fit the sleeve just right. Once I got it aligned properly, I took it to the sewing machine and I stitched it in place. Then I trimmed down the seam allowance and finished the raw edges with a zigzag stitch. Now it's on to the buttons. I had to mark placement for buttonholes so I could make sure they were properly spaced out. Now, sewing buttons is actually pretty easy. There are a few steps to it though. If you don't know how to do it, I highly recommend looking at your sewing machine's manual. It will teach you how to do it. And if you don't still have your manual, it's more than likely you can look it up online. Once I made the buttonholes, I moved on to adding the buttons. I also really appreciate that I can use my sewing machine to do this so I don't have to sew them on by hand. I still had to pull the threads through to the back side and knot them off, but that's way better than having to do it all by hand.
And there's our back. So the bodice is done now, I just need to add the skirt.
To start in on the skirt, I have to sew the side seams of all 3 layers that I'm making. After those are sewn, I can hem the bottom layer. I do this by first pressing the hem up once, then twice to enclose all the raw edges of the hem. Then I take it to the sewing machine and stitch right at the very top where it's folded.
Okay, so I am sitting here and I am about to hem the, what is it called? Organza. So I'm about to hem the organza and I'm like, I don't really know how to do this without making it look kind of ugly, because since it's sheer, all of those raw ends are going to be seen, and it's like, I really don't want that. So I have a crazy idea, and it's probably going to take a lot more time and effort than I really want to put in, but I'm probably going to try it anyways. So I have this ribbon that I was going to attach around the waist, around the bodice of the dress, and it just kind of occurred to me that maybe I could, you know, like enclose the organza hem in it. So that's what I'm going to try to do, and hopefully it turns out okay. So this is like a little test that I did, just to kind of see if I could do it and what it would look like, and I think it'll look okay when all is said and done.
To attach the lace to the organza, I put the wrong side of the lace to the wrong side of the skirt hem, and I stitched on the very edge close to the top of the ribbon. Once I had it sewn all the way around, I folded down the raw end of the ribbon, overlapping one side with the other, and sewed it in place. Then I trimmed off the edge of the hem and I folded the ribbon in half and sewed it on the very edge again. I repeated this on the other skirt overlay piece. Once I had the skirt pieces hemmed, I put them all together and decided I wasn't fully satisfied with how they looked. So I took the top layer of the overlay and I trimmed it to be the same size as the hemmed lining piece. This gave it just under an inch of difference and added a bit of dimension to the skirt. Now the skirt pieces are all ready to go. I basted them together at the very top. Now they can act as one layer on the next few steps. Now I need to make a placket at the top of the skirt. So I make the markings that I need to and do the stitches around the markings. Then I cut into the skirt to create a W in order to attach the placket. I align the placket piece with the markings on the skirt, right side to wrong side, and sew it together. After sewing, I iron it in place, and then I flip it over once, iron it, flip it over again, and iron it once more, this time to enclose all the raw edges. Then I sew that in place. Now I can trim off the excess placket fabric and sew some gathering stitches on the skirt. To gather the skirt, I sew 2 rows of basting stitches around the skirt top. Then I pull on the bobbin threads to bunch it all together. This part is a little bit tricky. I need to line up the skirt raw edges to the bodice raw edges. Now the reason that it's tricky is because I have to get the gathers just right in order for everything to fit. Now that I have everything all lined up and pinned together, it all fits, I can sew it. Then after sewing the bodice to the skirt, I finish off the raw edges with a zigzag stitch. Then I have one last seam to sew on the placket. It's one line about an inch from the bottom, just a diagonal. This will help the placket piece lay flat when my daughter's wearing it. Okay, now at this point, I could totally call the dress done and move on to other things. However, I just can't help myself and I have to be a little extra. And I did say I was going to do this part, but it is a little unnecessary. I've got some ribbon and I'm melting the edges so that it doesn't unravel. After the edges are all melted, I measure it up on the dress to make it fit around the waist. Now I'm going in with a needle and thread. I'm tacking the ribbon onto the waist all the way around one side. Now, in hindsight, I probably could have attached this ribbon in a different way to make it so that I could have tacked it all the way around and not covered one of the buttons, because it totally does that. But clearly, I didn't think it all the way through. I still want the ribbon, so I'm doing it anyways, and I'm just leaving one side untacked so I can get my baby in and out of it. It won't really affect the look of it, and it'll tie just the same. Okay, now the dress is done. Are you ready to see her in it?
Thanks so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this, and I'll catch you in the next one.